Wow. Pretty busy. So it's going to be a bit of a stupid question because I know it's a Power BI user. How many people on a daily basis use Power BI? Okay, so in that group, how many are sort of analysts? Right? How many work on sort of data warehousing and data engineering? Okay, good. So hopefully this won't be as boring as I think it will be in front of some proper Power BI developers. But so this is all about Synapse data warehousing. So we're going to go through a little bit of the history to find out, well, why are we where we are now? Why has Microsoft got a new product? Because it seems every so often announcement and says, you know that thing, new thing, forget about it. The new thing is what you want to be using. So we're going to address that as we go through. But, well, thank you for inviting me. Where is Johnny? All of a sudden, he's gone around there. Up to Manchester. He has told me he's going to show me a good time after this. So I just need someone to check on me tomorrow to make sure I made it back home okay. Oh, hey, do you know what? I am jealous because I'm never going to be able to grow a beard like Johnny's. Exactly. I think he can probably hear you at the back. But no, honestly, genuinely, thank you for coming. And this might be a less useful session than Matt's session, because Matt's session was just like, right, here's a tool, here's what you're going to do with it, and here's your outcome. Whereas I get to come along and say, this wonderful new service, you should probably start using it. Don't worry about it, just use the new thing. I want to go through, especially the history, because that interests me the most. Like why are we where we are now with these services? So we'll look at Fabric just very quickly, because who here has a basic understanding of what Fabric is? Right, so we will cover a few bits and pieces in that, but I do want to get into the warehouse service itself and look at the SQL engine, the engine that's underpinning what you're doing in the warehouse service, right? It's not a deep dive, right? But it's just going to give you enough information for you to go on and learn some more things, if you like, some best practices, why it does what it does, and also why certain features exist and why they don't exist as well. And then a little demo at the end, because we want something happening. So yeah, my name's Andy Cutler. That I've changed it now. So that used to take you to Twitter, but that now takes you to my link tree, which has YouTube and Twitter and my blog. I blog mostly at serverlesssql.com. So in the good old days, I used to blog about Synapse and serverless SQL pools, but increasingly more, it is Fabric. Most of the time I blog about configuring Synapse and CI/CD and those sorts of things, because unfortunately there's no new features now coming with Synapse. And I help co-organise Data Toboggan, which is an online conference. We specialised in Synapse Analytics because Synapse is now in Fabric. We're specialising in Fabric as well. Sort of subtle rebranding. All the videos for the last session are now on our YouTube channel. So there's all sorts of stuff there. Deep dives into OneLake, Power BI, DAX, all that good stuff. Yes, okay, so what is Fabric? So last May, I'm just going to start my clock as well, because I know we ran a bit late. Big announcement. So Microsoft Fabric was announced, and look, I'd been on the private preview for a few months, and even when it got announced, the amount of information that was pushed out was like phenomenal. And even I had to sit in a dark room for a while and disseminate a lot of the information. So there's plenty of time to get up to speed with what Microsoft are doing with Fabric, and especially what they're doing with Power BI and how Fabric fits into that ecosystem. But because there's so many things in Fabric, it is quite difficult to explain it. So the only thing I ever say is add significant functionality to a Power BI tenant. So we'll have a little look at the timeline, but included in the timeline is Synapse Analytics. And what Synapse Analytics did, it rolled up some services, data warehousing services, data loading pipelines, Spark notebooks, things like that, data warehousing and data engineering workloads, and said, right, if this is your profile, you come to this portal, do all your data warehousing through this portal. Brilliant, great. Oh, by the way, we're going to add some Power BI functionality into that as well. So if you're an analyst and you want to build models and build reports, you can do that within Synapse Studio. So what we're now, February 2024, I can honestly say, I don't think anyone has ever used Synapse Studio to build data sets or reports. Why would you? When there's a very, very popular interface there, the Power BI interface. So Microsoft essentially said, okay, well, that's a very popular interface. So we're going to take all of the data engineering and the data warehousing, and we'll push it into the Power BI tenant. So we've got these concepts like data warehousing and data engineering, real-time analytics. Yes, we're going to concentrate on the warehousing side of things. So this is where we get a bit of a departure, because when we were purchasing services before in Azure, we're purchasing certain compute tiers in our warehousing solutions. If we were on premises, we're buying hardware, and we've got memory and CPU and hard drive. One of the criticisms of Synapse was it had all sorts of different pricing models for all the different services, and you had to understand those pricing models and how it was charging you based on those services, which was a bit of a headache. I mean, it gave loads of consultants plenty of work. Microsoft then said, okay, well, we need to simplify this. So now you're going to be charged based on one charge, which is capacity. So this concept of capacity units, which Matt went in on a slide, how much you're going to pay for this capacity, and then it scales all the way up to meet your workload demands. I guess one of the issues with Fabric is that compute control has been taken away from you. So you can configure Spark, so you can create Spark pools, different sizes. But in terms of the warehouse service and the lakehouse SQL endpoint, which we'll touch on, you don't really have much control over that. In fact, you've got none. So it can be a little bit disconcerting to go from somewhere where you've got some control over, unless you follow the best practices and how to develop for this platform, you've got no way of adjusting any dials to suit what you need. I mean, it's tiny text at the bottom, but I think the biggest departure was that the storage is now underpinned by Delta. Is anyone familiar with Delta or Parquet? So yeah. So essentially Delta, we'll get onto it. Actually, I'll save that until later on. So in the Fabric Warehouse service, so basically what Microsoft want to do is they want to provide a T-SQL based service in the cloud to model your data. So where the warehouse service sits in is essentially to be used as models data. So Azure, Azure. I can't say Azure. I always have to say Azure. Yeah. I also said Synapse a lot until someone said you probably should be saying Synapse, because if I was, the prompts would say sign apps rather than Synapse. So it was all a bit of a pain in the backside. But ultimately, the warehouse is sitting there to be your repository of your model data. Right? So if you're a follower of Kimball, your facts, your dimensions, yes, your OBTs, your one big tables. If you like data vaults, then I suppose you could implement it in the warehouse, but it's for your modeled data. That's what Microsoft want you to use the warehouse service for. Right, so this is where it gets a bit marketing, because honestly, I don't have any access under the hood to find out what's going on in the service. It's basically all abstracted away. So there's no configuration, there's auto maintenance, creating tables. Your tables are basically being optimized without you really having to do anything, and that's based on the storage. Again, a little bit disconcerting. But all those familiar structures that you've been using, databases, tables, views, store procedures, they're all present. Functions, yes, but a limited footprint of functions that you can create. Again, the biggest departure, and we'll talk about that filter Parquet in a bit, is that Microsoft have, well, they're not trendsetters here. Like, this has been done by other companies, Databricks, for example, Snowflake, right, where they've separated their compute engines from their storage engines. So, for example, Databricks can actually write to Fabric service and read from it, whereas, I don't know, take Oracle and SQL Server, you probably couldn't switch a SQL Server. Take those MDF and LDF files, copy them over to an Oracle server, connect them up, and everything's going to work. It's not going to work. And yes, so this well, open storage format, Parquet, on one of the slides we'll talk about in a bit. It's the biggest departure. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall when Microsoft were talking about implementing the storage mechanism, because I think it's big in terms of how they've changed how they're storing data in their service. And the warehouse does implement ACID, so the concept of making sure in a consistent state, free from corruption, with as minimal interference in your workload possible. And that is done by Delta. So Delta itself is not a storage format. All Delta does is handle the transactions between your compute and your storage. That's all it does. It's a bit of a disservice, but very important here. Now, in the realm of Power BI, we've got workspaces. So everyone knows what workspace is. All right, you click new workspace, your reports, data sets. But actually, it started with things like the XMLA endpoint, right, where we got an endpoint and we can actually connect to a Power BI management studio. Brilliant. Now, in the world of Fabric, yes. So, I mean, all these items are quite tiny. And this is a bit of a silly example because I've just created an item, every type within Fabric. There's pipelines there, there's models, there's data sets, lake houses, but there's a lot of stuff there in our workspace. But actually, under the hood, it's like a server. So up here, this easily, and honestly, I can type that. XYZ 648 of a failed X. Missed the H off at the beginning, right? But every workspace will get that as an endpoint. And a big long string at the front. And you can connect to it using client tools. And because it's a cloud warehouse and cloud warehouse platforms, especially when cloud warehouse platforms let you log into a web interface and just start creating tables, okay, fine, I'm in a web interface, but what if I want to keep my schema source control? What if I want control over that? So yes, we've got tools like Azure Data Studio, not SSDT in Visual Studio, I'm afraid. I've given up with Microsoft on the love for SSDT. I want to kind of funnel you towards Azure Data Studio. Okay, you know what? It's not a hill I'm going to die on. But what we can do is, we can define our schema. But yeah, I mean, I've hard coded some tables there. It doesn't matter. Your SQL objects came within a project and can be deployed to that endpoint. So there is a source control and a SQL as well. Good, because well, Mr. Paul at the back there, you worked with dedicated SQL pools. For a while, we waited for Microsoft to actually implement database projects so you could source control your schema. I'm glad that it's front and center here. So in terms of like notable concepts, because obviously this stuff a massive load of things that the warehouse has, but some of the things that I want to call out is that you've got caching, right? Because again, it's slightly disconcerting that the storage is based on this new Parquet file format that sits in this, well, ephemeral storage called OneLake, which is essentially Azure Data Lake Gen 2. I might get in trouble Microsoft for saying that, but it's essentially an Azure storage account, multiple storage accounts, depending on the region that you're in. So yeah, caching is important. So the caching within the warehouse operates at two levels. Yeah, you've got some in-memory cache. That's a hot cache. That's everything that is, possibly being reported on in Power BI or loaded, queried. But it also has an SSD cache as well. So if a data set is far too large to fit in, it can go into the SSD. So we've got a couple of levels there in terms of caching. It'll cover you in terms of statistics. So if you're running queries, it will automatically create statistics for you based on heavily used queries, but you've also got the option to statistics yourself. However, you're going to have to manage the statistics yourself, but create a T-SQL script, iterate through, absolutely no problem at all. Again, with workload management, we get into slightly disconcerting territory again, because you don't really have much control in the warehouse service, which I guess you could say is a good thing because you don't have to worry about it. But then if things aren't working as expected and you can't do anything other than go on Twitter. Is anyone having a problem in North Europe today? Yeah, so that's a consideration in there as well. But with workload management, what Microsoft do is, with workspaces, so when I say workspaces are a little bit like servers, there is some resource boundary in those workspaces. So when people talk about, well, what workspace do I need in my architecture? So if we, Johnny cover your ears, if we talk about the medallion architecture with, your bronze, silver and gold, sorry, I'll use those terms. How many workspaces do we need? Well, it can be a management thing, but it can also be a resource thing as well. Because what Fabric will do, it will, put a degree of separation in terms of the resources it's allocating those workspaces. So if you have everything stuffed into one workspace, very well for you. Did you have a session here? Yeah, last month. So the warehouse, it does now support Direct Lake. I mean, there's a lot of caveats with Direct Lake, but it's also really good. Unfortunately, with Direct Lake, if there are any objects implemented in a warehouse, that use SQL endpoint. We'll talk about SQL endpoint in a minute. Things like row level security, column level security, which is quite a big thing, right? It's, if you get the opportunity to implement it somewhere, and Power BI can just connect in and not have to input data, brilliant. The only problem is Direct Lake isn't supported here, unfortunately. But also, what is useful is that in a warehouse, if you define your relationship, memory keys, your foreign keys within your warehouse, that'll propagate through into Power BI. So I'm probably going to start to show my Power BI noddiness here, but a while ago, it's probably like 5 years ago or something, there was an option, wasn't there, in Power BI to say, import the relationships from my data source. So if you define primary keys and foreign keys, Power BI would inherit those and show your tables. Well, you have that here. Now, this is where we start to get some of that functionality that Delta brings to the fold. And Databricks have had features like this for years. Microsoft have implemented one aspect, it's a shallow clone. Basically, what you can do is you can just clone a table. So if you want to snapshot your table period in time, if you want to snapshot your table because you're testing some changes, or you're snapshotting your table backup scenario, you can do that here. It's a very lightweight operation. Metadata. And then lastly, so the performance guardrails, right, so you buy the capacity from Microsoft. So you buy an F64, an F2, or an F128, whatever, you're getting a certain amount of capacity units that you can use. Capacity units in themselves is a whole session. So it's very difficult to try and get it into about 10 seconds. Capacity units isn't really a measure of how powerful your fabric capacity is. It's simply a measure of how many things you're going to be able to do in parallel. So an F2 capacity, which costs you a couple £100 a month, in theory, can do the workload of an F64. You just can't do many workloads in parallel. But what the warehouse does, it implements these guardrails to say at a specific SKU, if your workload exceeds that SKU for a point in time, and I think, Matt, you talked about bursting and smoothing very quickly, Microsoft are not going to penalise you if some of your workloads need just a little bit more juice than you're paying for at that point in time that your workload is running. All they'll do is, further down the line, when your capacity isn't doing much, they'll just borrow a little bit back. And that's the concept of smoothing. Yeah, so you're kind of borrowing some compute for a little while. As long as you can pay it back in terms of your capacity not doing much for a few hours, you're all good. However, you don't want that to go out of control. So at specific SKUs, it'll only burst up to a factor of 4, 8, 16, etc. Stops it going out of control, basically. So we come to the timeline, right? So in terms of the timeline, I'll probably get a little bit too excited about the timeline, but just the way it is. So back in the early 2000s, so that's really 21 years ago, isn't it? A guy called Stu Frost created a company called Legro. The reason he created that company is because customers had been sick of companies like Teradata just basically holding people to ransom and saying, well, if you've got multi-terabyte warehouse scenarios, come to us, but it's going to cost you quite a bit. So their initial implementation of their data warehouses was all based on Ingress and Linux. And then guess who bought them? Oh, Microsoft. Microsoft love buying things, don't they? Except in this time period, or in this this multiverse, Microsoft didn't just buy them and deprecate the product. They bought the product and they retained the staff to branch off their SQL Server version and call it Parallel Data Warehouse. This is where you start to get that separation of storage and compute. Now, it was a very specialized appliance. It cost a lot of money. And men in dark suits and sunglasses turned up, screens up around the data center, and then installed things, and no one was able to touch it. It was a bit of a black box. But that was the start of it, really. And then around 2015, maybe the end of 2014, something like that, I started using it from 2016. Microsoft released the SQL Data Warehouse service. So this was the service in Azure, which was based on Parallel Data Warehouse. Yes, there was some architecture change. Essentially, it was the same product, but now a hell of a lot easier to use as well. For instance, create an Azure SQL Data Warehouse, load it with data, and then wonder why everything was running so slowly, because then you needed to understand the concept of distributing your data and all of that dull stuff, which we'll come on to. And then 2019. So, anyone remember the announcement for Synapse Analytics? Right. So this is the first convergence of the Synapse Analytics, a big umbrella term, because now bring your data warehousing workloads, your data engineering workloads, your data loading workloads and data integration, and we thrown in some Power BI as well. We'll build some reports and data sets in there. We've got a fancy interface, and we've renamed or rebadged SQL Data Warehouse into dedicated SQL pools, and buried it, really. Like they just took the Azure SQL Data Warehouse service that was I stupidly thought was a big flagship product, rebadged it as dedicated SQL pool, just sort of pushed it over to one side. And then the new person comes along, serverless SQL pools. Microsoft created. We'll go into that later. So I haven't connected it to anything in terms of lineage. It probably has a lot of similarities with the way that Spark works, but it's a new engine, and that's the engine that underpins the SQL engine in Fabric. And poor old dedicated SQL pools is just going to go on until they switch the hardware off. So in terms of this SQL endpoint, again, marketing, right? It's an auto-scale, fault-tolerant and distributed compute engine because, well, actually, even if you wanted to get at it, that's really what it is. Because it's basically responding to a workload, working out what resources does that workload need to complete in a reasonable amount of time, going and creating the compute nodes behind the scenes, giving it the jobs to do, collating the results back. And it did start its life as serverless SQL pools. Now, with serverless SQL pools, it was a read-only engine. You could write data to it, and some people did. I mean, I used to, because it was quite useful for writing Parquet, this compressed file format, out to data lake storage. But that was about it. There was no nuance to it at all. But now what we can do, yes, we can read the data, but we can actually write the data. So now we've got DML. So we can insert, we can update, we can delete, we can select. There was a white paper. If anyone has insomnia or has any trouble sleeping, I can fully recommend the Polaris white paper and having a read. It is very academic, and to be quite honest with you, I've probably got about 2.5 okay, I'll save this for a rainy day. But essentially, it underpins how you can build an engine that's fault tolerant, i.e., these compute nodes will take jobs. If one of the compute nodes, for any reason, fails or becomes unavailable, another one will appear and just get given. Oh, at the bottom there. You can see that I added the word boundary and didn't increase the size of the. On purpose. So like I said, in Fabric workspaces, there is a concept of a boundary of workspace. But also within workload, we do have a difference between ingestion and querying. So what Microsoft do, they recognize is not a data modification query. It'll separate it from any workloads that are manipulating data. So there is, again, another sort of resource boundary in terms of what it'll do. So Microsoft say that your querying won't affect your data loading. And essentially what that means in the as simple as possible in the underlying architecture, you've got a front end, but you've got an endpoint. Right? You issue queries and workloads to that endpoint. Right? That endpoint sends it to the DQP, the distributed query processor. This is the thing that generates the query count. So if anyone ever looked at SQL Server or anything like that, it will determine how to run that workload. It'll create several plans. It will pick the one that's the quickest or the least cost intensive. And it'll decide, well, how many compute nodes behind the scenes to run that workload. Now, it's doing that quicker than I've explained. Allocating compute nodes to your workloads, doing those workloads, giving you back the results. What that means in terms of the services within Fabric is that we've got the lakehouse service as well as the warehouse service. So the warehouse service, purely T-SQL. You can read the data that's being generated under the hood using Spark. You specify a big URL to where the data is, fine, but you can't write to it. Yeah? You can't modify the data. That's all being done with SQL. But with the lakehouse is very Spark centric. So Scarlet, Python, R, that kind of thing. You can read and write data using those languages. But you also get a SQL endpoint, which is the same SQL endpoint warehouse, except it's read only. Right? So there was a concept in Synapse Analytics where you had serverless SQL pools where you could write queries over data that was stored in a data lake, but you also had these Spark databases as well. A little bit confusing when it was first released, but this is essentially what they've done here. Right? So with the warehouse, SQL endpoint is reading and writing. With the lakehouse, it's the same endpoint, the data. Right? So reading and writing with the warehouse and reading from the lakehouse, and then your client that SQL endpoint. So a lakehouse SQL endpoint will behave the same as a warehouse SQL endpoint in Management Studio or Azure Data Studio. You know, if you have Tableau, you can connect Tableau to it. Right, storage. You know what? Apologies. I thought this slide was a little bit closer to the front. I keep saying, oh, I'll talk about Parquet later. So the biggest departure is that now Microsoft have gone in on Parquet and Delta as storage format and how they're handling transactions and history. So if you use a tool like Azure Storage, well, I mean, it's exactly as the name suggests, you're exploring your storage accounts. you can get at and see what's happening behind the scenes in terms of and see that, yeah, so what Microsoft have done, they've just implemented this format called Delta, right? So these are the Parquet files, right, that are in the folders. Again, I won't be able to remember the names off the top of my head, but essentially the Parquet files are where your data sits. So the actual data itself, it's going to contain the schema, it's going to contain statistics. And actually, it's not a file format that you can just right click. It's a, is it a binary? Do you consider it a binary file format? Yeah. And then it's not really one that you can get at. Power BI can read it, connect to a storage data account. But Delta is where the magic happens, because Delta is versioning the data. So if you insert data, if you update data, if you delete data, it's not actually removing any of the data. It's just generating new Parquet files and then updating that log to say, well, the current data is in these Parquet files. The engine comes in and wants to select the data. Delta is saying, well, that's the latest version of this data. So in Delta, you've got the concept of things like time travel. So you can just go back to a previous version of your data. Now, in the warehouse service, you don't really have much control over the Delta files. It's all been automatically maintained for you. We might skip over this because that's a horrible table. Essentially, I just want to call out a couple of things on here, really, is that on partitioning, yes, you can partition in SQL Server. Yes, you can partition in dedicated SQL pools. At the moment, you haven't got much option. No option. Partition your data within a warehouse, which has caused a little bit of consternation. Lakehouse, yes, but the warehouse, unfortunately, not at the moment. Indexes. So there's no concept of indexes in the Fabric warehouse at the moment. Don't know whether that will change. And that's because the file format itself, the Parquet file format, is an index. It's a column store index, really. Column store indexes, were included in SQL Server 2012. They underpinned the main storage mechanism. It's like the Vertipack engine. It's just columns of data, it's pressing that data. Now, why? So this is going into, well, why Microsoft created the Fabric warehouse? So, why another product? Yep, so essentially a bit more of a specialized platform. So if you're building data warehouses, if you're building analytics solutions, you probably don't need everything that SQL Server used to offer. But I remember SQL Server when it had a business intelligence licensed edition. Just got rid of that and it was just standard and enterprise. But obviously, if you've got an enterprise SQL Server, it's got a lot of features, most of which are not really useful in data warehousing. The awkward data size issue. So this was always one that I've had trouble with, especially with Synapse Analytics. So client would say, we want to migrate our on-premises SQL warehouse into the cloud. We want platforms. We don't want to have to manage our own servers. What's your data footprint? About 250 to 300 gig. Oh, right, okay. Dedicated SQL pools is out. So we're going to use Synapse, then we could put it in Parquet files and distribute it using serverless SQL pools. We could look at your SQL database. You don't really want to run a SQL server in a VM. You had all these awkward conversations about it. Because ultimately, Synapse dedicated SQL pools was a very specialized service. And it still is. So the awkward data size means your warehouse can just run, well, if you've got 10 meg, 10 gig, 100 gig, a terabyte. So yeah, it becomes a lot easier to be able to describe using the service from the size of your data perspective. Yes, development on Synapse Gen 2 just kind of stopped. The biggest complaint was there was no auto scale. There was no pause or auto pause or resume of the service. You had to understand your workload. Yes, you could use automation to resize your dedicated SQL pool, but it was more steps, and it could never handle, well, workloads that were a little bit unpredictable. Right? And everyone complains, well, I'm paying this money, and sometimes it's not really doing much. So, well, yeah, pause it. Okay, but I have to switch it back on again, and yeah. So now with the warehouse, yes, you're paying for capacity units, right? But that's an overall concept. The warehouse is just running within those capacity units and just using the capacity units it needs to do its workload. Right, so citizen data developers. You've heard of the term, where because all the data warehousing and data engineering are now being added into BI, really, there's a lot more crossover. So where I didn't really see many people coming into the world of Synapse, so the world of Synapse is coming into BI, and that opens up a lot more possibilities. And the way Microsoft are positioning warehouses, I mean, yeah, you can use it for enterprise scenarios. Did anyone use Power BI data marts? Yeah, I don't even think they're generally available. It's a bit of a precursor to what we've got here in terms of the warehousing services. And well, essentially, I think Microsoft up with companies like Databricks and Snowflake and DuckDB. Did anyone follow a guy called Mim on Twitter? Right. Say again. Mm. But isn't that X in brackets formerly known as Twitter, like Prince? So Mim, he now works for Microsoft. He'll probably get a bit confused if I tweet out, "Hey, this is Mim." But honestly, like the best guy, just knows his stuff with cloud warehousing platforms and doesn't pull his punches in terms of taking Microsoft Databricks or Snowflake. And I've learned a lot off that guy. So in terms of the warehouse loading options, yeah, we've got code. SQL, right? So my favorite, copy into, that was what we did in the world of dedicated SQL pools. It can parallelize your workloads, and it was the fastest method to ingest a dedicated SQL pool. We've got CTF, create table as select. So it does seem in the world of fabric warehouses that some of the best practices are, it might be more beneficial instead of updating a table if you've got a large amount of small amount, large amount of data in relation to the overall table size, just rewrite the table again. Insert into values. Now, this service isn't really small singleton inserts. It's not really what it's designed for. It's a lot faster now than it used to be. One row of data, let's say it was some metadata into a table, it would take 6, 7, 8 seconds to run. So when I was and said, well, how long is that taking to insert one row of data into a table? Sorry. Can we get to the 1 billion rows? Because it does it a bit quicker. But yes, you can use things like a JDBC, a PyODBC in notebooks to work with the data warehouses. Now the low no code options. So we've got the brute force pipelines, right? So that's just that, get data from here and get it into there as quickly as possible. And we've got data flows Gen 2. So this is interesting. So now we get into the world of Power Query. So who uses Power Query? Yeah. Yeah. Is it Power Query for the win? I mean, I have my issues with data flows Gen 2 in terms of, you know, its robustness in terms of building frameworks and things like that. But they've just released some fast loading data flows. And if you've got transformations, it works. Oh, references there. So there's loads of stuff there. So I think, there we go. James Serra. So James Serra is he's really good. He works for Microsoft. He used to work for EY, and that guy is brilliant in terms of getting an overall look, and especially their history. So, did you say 5 minutes? 5 minutes ish. Right, so in terms of what this looks like now, hang on a minute, am I going to be able to just bring that up? Let me close that down. Open up there, no, hang on. There we go, right. So in terms of workspaces, so yes, I've already created a warehouse. Now creating a warehouse is pretty simple. I'll actually switch to my warehouse persona and go back to my workspace. Excellent question. So yes, some form of premium capacity. So at the moment, you'll notice up in that top right-hand corner, hang on a minute, 59 days left. What? Just giving it away, aren't they? Yeah, we'll all pay later. We'll all pay later with our blood. But yes, so absolutely spot on. So we can purchase capacity through your local friendly seller, or go into your office portal and go through the process of purchasing fabric capacities, or you can use Azure capacities. I use these all the time. So I use these to test capacities in different regions, different sizes of capacities. So yeah, you can see I've created capacities in all these different areas. If I go into a capacity and go into the size of the capacity, then yeah, I mean, that is your pay-as-you-go pricing, right? So if you really did want an F64, which is the equivalent in Power BI, then I wouldn't suggest using it as your SQL unless you were going to pause it a lot, because it's going to cost you about £3,000 more than you could probably purchase it for from Microsoft or your reseller of your choice with appropriate discounts. But yes, so we've got these fabric SKUs that we are then allocating to workspaces. So for example, in my workspace here, if I open up the workspace settings and have a little look at the premium section, we've got that comprehensive list of the licensing in your Power BI workspace. So for example, if it's just a pro workspace, yes, premium per user. I don't have a premium capacity. This is my own tenant. If I had embedded, if I had, well, actually, let's just switch one of these on now. Not an F64. Let me just do that one. Not made of money. I'd be able to select that fabric capacity and assign that workspace that capacity. But I've got trial, right? So we're using a trial fabric capacity. capacity for this? F64. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so the trial capacity is equivalent to an F64. The only problem is when Microsoft are announcing new features, new services, sometimes buried at the bottom in that list of considerations and limitations is does not work on a trial capacity. So there are, you know, what they give with one hand, they'll take back with another. But yes, so assigned our Power BI workspace to a Fabric capacity, that then enables Fabric features. Yes, your local friendly Power BI / Fabric administrator is going to have to have enabled Fabric in your tenant. So if we open up the admin portal, then yep, so you know users can create Fabric items. Now, of course, in my own tenant, it's just enabled, but organisations might want to actually, yeah, specify just a group of users that have access to Fabric features. So if anyone's worried about just switching on Fabric and it just being made available for everyone, no, create your Entra group, add your users to that group, add your group to this setting. They are the ones, the Fabric items. So I think with that, Johnny has called time on that. Say again? It's a wrap up. 1 minute. 1 minute, generous. Okay. In 60 seconds. Okay, so in 60 seconds, what I'll do is I'm going to go to, no, we won't do it in 60 seconds, but essentially, so if I go back to my Azure Data Studio, I can go into my database projects, right? So, you know, I've created my tables, I've given it definitions, yeah, I've got my dimensions, I've got my facts. I can then make sure that in my target platform, I've got Synapse data warehouses in Microsoft Fabric. That shocked me when I announced it, to be honest with you. But now it means I can right click. If I build, what it's going to do is behind the scenes, it's going to build a familiar database. DAC pack. Anyone familiar with what a DAC pack is? It's basically, it encapsulates the schema information of a database. Tables, views, store procedures, and can be used deployment. And I'm relieved that it is available within have that storage, source control, CI/CD, your databases. And I think with that, I'm genuinely out of time, and I've taken 3 more minutes. Your time than I should have done. Yeah, I know.